Hello, my name is Tim64 aka Onthestoop, and I'm making a video exclusively for Mike Turner's Crushing Low Stakes Poker Sit and Go guide. And just a quick bit of introduction on me. Here on the screen you can see my website www.onthestoop.co.uk. I'm a six max specialist. Onthestoop is my username, my screen name, and all the poker sites I play on. I'm also a poker coach. This is my site, as I say, and you'll get lots of information here and links. I'm also a pokerstrategy.com registered coach. That's my avatar there, Tim64. And then finally, Tim on the Stoop on YouTube and Tim on the Stoop on Twitter, so you can find out more about me using those links. So what I'm going to do today is run through some hands that I played in a $15 6 max regular speed sit and go, and I've selected about 20 hands which we're going to look at, probably about 2 or 3 minutes per hand, all played at different stages of the tournament against different opponents, and we're going to use those hands to illustrate important concepts both in poker generally and in sit and go specifically. So without further ado, let's jump into the hands. Okay, so on the screen now you can see the Holder Manager 2 replayer window, and for each player you'll see a black box containing various different numbers, and these are the statistics that the program shows for the different players. Just very briefly so that you can understand this, if we look at this player Ede Viaro on the top left of our screen over here, we can see that we have 144 hands worth of information for him. At the moment in this hand he has a stack of 75 big blinds. His aggression factor is 3 based on the hands played in this tournament. His voluntary put in pot, that's really the percentage of hands that he plays, is 30. His pre-flop raising range is 11%. 3-bet percentage is 4.3. His 3-bet against steals is 11%. Overall steal 15%, steal from button 21%, steal from a small blind 11%, and fold to steal overall 52%. Okay, and let's jump into this first hand. This is right at the beginning of the sit and go, and you can see that we're under the gun with 8-9 of hearts. The concept behind this hand is that of playing suited connector hands early on in the tournament, if at all. The reason for that is that when you play with 75 big blinds or thereabouts, let's say anywhere more than 50, between 50 and 100, you have a much better chance of hitting your draw, which is what you're playing the hand for generally, because with a big stack to pot ratio you're more likely to get to the turn and the river with chips behind with which you can bet when you hit your draw. Whereas if you have, let's say, 20 to 25 big blinds, you want to be playing top pair, top kicker poker much more often. I think one of the mistakes players often make is to try and play these kinds of hands late on in the tournament rather than playing them in the early stages. Okay, so we make an open raise from under the gun, and we get a couple of callers, and we see a flop of 4 King Jack with 2 diamonds. As you can see, we pretty much miss this flop, and this is the next concept to explain in this video, which is if you're called by more than one opponent and your equity in the hand is very low or almost non-existent, you should almost always be just planning to give up. And so with that in mind, we just go ahead and check, even though we're the pre-flop raiser, and you can see that the button bets when checked to, and the middle position player calls, and we just get out of the hand and let these guys play the pot. Okay, it's very likely that at least one of these players will have either a king or a jack or some kind of straight draw like queen 10 or a flush draw. So with very little equity in the hand, no way of winning it, we're happy to just give up. And there's nothing wrong with just giving up if you've raised and you don't think you're going to get 2 folds often enough. Okay, so straight on to the next hand now. Okay, so in this hand it's folded round to the small blind who limps here pre-flop. Generally speaking, if someone limps in the small blind, you should be planning to raise quite often because the limp normally indicates weakness, and therefore we can usually take the pot down either pre-flop or post-flop by by using aggression. But in this case, if we look at this player here, VPIP of 22, pre-flop raise of 14, this is a fairly tight player, so overall against his limping range we're not really ahead with our king 6 suited, so we're quite happy to just check and see a flop. So if we go to the flop here, 5, 7, 8, we have of course an open-ended straight draw here, but we also have some showdown value because our king high will often be the highest card. Let's say if our opponent has a hand like Queen Jack or 10 Jack, we're going to be ahead of those hands already. So it's not necessary for us to bet our draw here, although betting certainly wouldn't be a mistake. So our opponent checks to us and we decide to check back with showdown value in our draw. So when it comes to the turn, we turn top pair, and when he checks to us again, it's time to start betting, trying to build the pot in case he should have a hand like 5, 6 or 7, 9. We want to get some value before the river gets perhaps more scary for him, were an ace to come out for example. So we just bet into the pot and we get the fold. Okay, on to the next hand. Okay, so here we are in a blind versus blind situation, and we're going to raise our king 9 offsuit up, and the reason for that is simple. There are only 2 more players to act, and we have a hand that's a long way above the, as it were, average starting hand. It's a hand in around the top 25% of starting hands, so definitely want to open for a raise. If we open with a limp like we saw in the previous hand, we're already on the back foot. Our opponent can use aggression to take the pot away from us. So we open with a raise. I choose this sizing of 2.5x from the small blind. We get called, and it's a really good flop for us. Nice dry flop with not too many draws there. Really only a hand like 6, 8 is going to be possible in terms of the draws. No flush draws, so nothing really to be scared of on this pot. We're just going to make a continuation bet of half pot. We get called on this board, and we see that the turn is a 6. So we have a choice here. We can either bet again for value, or we can check. And one of the reasons that we might want to check here is if we think about what our opponent's hand range looks like when they call us on the flop, we see that it's actually not that easy for him to have a strong hand here. Well, it's fairly hard for him to have top pair because 2 of the 9s are already gone, so there are only 2 more in the deck. And again, there are not that many 7s or 3s in his pre-flop calling range. Of course, there'll be some hands like 7, 6 suited, maybe ace 3 he'll call from time to time, but not so many. So very often when he calls this flop, it's actually with 2 overcards and the intention of trying to take the pot away from us on later streets if we show weakness. So what we can actually do in this situation is disguise our hand strength and show some weakness and let him take a stab at the pot, and he obliges us by doing that. Now we could check raise our hand, but then we're almost really overplaying our hand, turning a hand into a bluff to try and represent, you know, some sort of straight like 5-8 or 2 pair. So we just go for a check call here on the turn, keep the pot size manageable, and then on the river most of the draws are still missed, so we check again, see if our opponent wants to bluff at us. He checks back, and we see that he actually had a very strong hand here. So you can see that whenever you play your hands in a passive manner, as it were, hit to win, you run the risk of having a better hand outflop you, or indeed just outplay you. So here what we see is that the opponent had the best hand pre-flop, but he didn't re-raise it, and therefore he could really only win the pot if he actually, you know, flopped a jack or an ace. And what he actually decided to do was turn his quite strong showdown value of ace jack high into a bluff on the turn to try and make me fold some, you know, hand that had outflopped him. Or he may have just been betting to try and get a free showdown. But in any event, you should generally try not to turn hands with good showdown value into bluffs. Okay, so we jump on to the next hand. And here we have jack 10 offsuit. We're going to make a raise from the button. Why nice and simple. We want to play decent hands that flop reasonably well in position, and particularly against players who are likely to not be, you know, particularly strong. As you can see, the big blind in this hand is fairly loose. He's playing 37% of all hands, so we're quite happy to play in position against him. He does call us, and we flop king 9-3. Our opponent checks to us, and now we have to have a quick think about our equity in this hand. Well, what we can see is that not only do we have a gut shot to the nut straight if the queen comes, but we also have a backdoor flush draw. So that means that if we get to the turn, 1 in every 4 turns approximately is going to give us additional equity, i.e. chance of winning in the form of another heart. So that's a bit of added bonus here, which means we definitely want a continuation bet here. So we make a bet of a little less than half pot, and our opponent makes a very small check raise here, 2x check raise. You can see down here in the middle our pot odds are 16% here, so we can't really fold here given that we have very often decent outs. We're only a long way behind here if our opponent has a king, and often he's going to be check raising hands like we've got, indeed maybe a hand like a flush draw. So the question is, should we call this check raise or re-raise? And what we see again is that in most cases the aggressive line is the best line. If we simply call here but we don't improve on the turn, our opponent's going to bet and we're usually going to have to fold. And instead of calling, we can use the power of our draw, which after all is to the nuts, to re-bluff our opponent and maybe even make him fold a better hand than us. So we go ahead and re-raise, and our opponent folds, which is a great result for us since we're getting him to fold with jack high. In fact, this opponent actually flashed one of his cards, which you can do on some poker software, and showed that he check raised the 9 and folded it. And again, what you see there is an example of a player almost turning a hand into a bluff. What I assume he was doing, he was check raising for information to try and find out whether his pair of 9s was good, because he didn't want to be in that uncomfortable position of just check calling down when you're out of position, not really ever knowing where you stand. Well, I guess that probably tells us two things. Firstly, you want to try and not be calling out of position very often in the first place, because it does put you in awkward spots. But secondly, again, if you turn a hand into a bluff, you leave yourself open to getting re-bluffed, especially by a draw. Okay, so on to the next hand. We've got Queen 10 offsuit here in the big blind, and this loose player here open raises. So now we're just going to have a quick look at his stats. So we click on pre-flop, and we can see that he's open raising 46% of all hands from this particular position. That's a really high first in open raise, and again what it means is that it's easy for us to exploit this looseness by 3-betting him. So when it comes around to us, we decide again, like we were just talking about, we don't want to be passive and call out of position here, because then we have to hit to win. And in poker, if you play a hit to win strategy, usually it's pretty hard to make a lot of money. So what we do is we make a smallish 3-bet here, knowing that our opponent very rarely has a hand that he can get to showdown with if we put pressure on him. We get a call as we're sort of expecting to, but with this kind of Broadway hand, we usually know more or less where we stand on the flop. Here we're lucky enough to flop a pair. But if we look at this board, there are lots of draws possible. There are straight draws and there are flush draws possible, and we don't really want to play a pot for our whole stack here. So we actually can start by checking, and this is both with the intention of trying to control the size of the pot, and also to just induce our opponent to bet with worse hands which he might not call if we were to bet ourselves. So this is another strategy that you can employ. Okay, our opponent checks back, which tells us often that he has some kind of showdown value. So when the turn is a card which is more or less a blank, we're going to go ahead and bet for value here, and we get called. And on the river, one of the cards that our opponent might have checked back is a 9, which means it's much harder for us to get value from a worse hand by betting. So especially if he would fold a hand like pocket fives to a bet. So again, what we can do is check here with the plan of calling most river bets, because we expect that our opponent might bet a busted flush draw or straight draw. As it is, he checks back and we see that he did have some showdown value. And again, what this shows is that whenever you play hands in a passive manner and allow yourself to be 3-bet, even if you happen to have the best hand pre-flop, you're not always going to get that hand to showdown in a manner that you want to. So actually this is not a great call by him, because most of the time when I have an ace it's going to be a bigger ace. So again, unless he hits the nut flush draw, he's never going to be really happy with his hand. So we prefer to see a fold from him pre-flop. Okay, on to the next hand. We have another suited connector. Again, it's okay to raise this hand as a steal. We will have position on our opponent, so that's fine. And we get called here and we flop a gut shot and a flush draw. So pretty strong hand. Our opponent actually leads into us here for half pot. And what we see in contrast to the hand where we had an open-ended straight draw plus king high, is that here we don't really have the best hand here on the flop very often. It's much more likely that our opponent has us beat with queen high, king high, or ace high, or maybe even a higher flush draw. So again, if we choose to just call here, we're leaving ourselves open to getting bluffed off our draw on the turn, or really again we have to hit our draw to win the pot. Whereas if we can use the power of our straight and flush draws to power our aggression with a raise here, we make it much more uncomfortable and difficult for our opponent. Again, if he wanted to get all the money here on the flop, we wouldn't mind that too much. We have pretty good equity even against a hand like, you know, pocket jacks here. But generally speaking, we're going to be making our opponent fold a hand like, you know, ace 10, which he might have called pre-flop, and he's betting on the flop just as it were to find out where he is, to try and get us to fold some hands. So we just take the pot away from him by raising here, and it's very difficult for him to continue here without a strong hand, so we do get the fold. Alright, so on to the next hand, and here we face a raise from middle position, and we have ace queen suited on the button. It's definitely possible to call here, but in general we should want to play hands aggressively because it gives us more ways to win. So we opt for a fairly small 3-bet here. In general, when you're 3-betting in position, you can keep your 3-bet a little bit smaller than you might need to make it out of position, because you already have a positional advantage, and therefore you don't need to make the pot so big to compensate for being out of position for save. So we make the 3-bet, and the blinds both fold, and with the original raiser calls. This already puts him at a disadvantage in the hand, even for example were he to have a better hand than us. Say for example if he has ace king here, he's very often going to have to let go of that hand post flop unless he flops really well. So his play is going to be much more a case of fit or fold, hit to win poker, whereas we can actually just play our position and play the overall range of hands that we're representing. That's it. When we get to this particular flop here, it's very hard for us to represent anything, in that there are no high cards here that we can claim to have hit. So when we continuation bet this board, what we're really saying is we've got a high pair such as tens, jacks, kings, queens or aces, and that's a very small range. So we may well not get hands like ace queen, ace king, ace jack to fold, and certainly we wouldn't expect to get any pairs to fold on this board. So given that we have a club here on board, which means that any turn card that's a club is going to give us more equity in the hand, we can actually opt for a delayed continuation bet, and that is check behind, see what our opponent does on the turn. Once he checks again, he's really showing quite a bit of weakness, or at least that he doesn't have a hand that he can bet for value. So right now we're just going to make a smallish bet, try and take the pot away from him. Very often we're going to have the best hand here anyway, because he may have a hand like king queen or ace jack, but this bet has the double, let's say, advantage that our opponent may just lay down ace-king here because he doesn't want to face a bet on the river. So I think it's a decent option here now that the board maybe got a little bit more scary for a hand like ace-king, since there are straights possible. So we just take it down and move on to the next hand. Okay, so we have king-queen in the small blind here. We get a raise again from this very loose player, raising lots and lots of hands under the gun. Once again, not wanting to play the hand passively in a hit-to-win fashion, we just opt for a 3-bet here, knowing that the majority of his range can't really handle a 3-bet, and, you know, confident in our ability to negotiate our way post-flop. Very happy to stack off if we hit any kind of decent pair with our king-queen against such a wide range of hands. So we just get the fold there, take down a nice pot without needing to see any flop. Okay, and on to the next hand. We have ace-8 here. It's certainly reasonable to raise this hand pre-flop. It's not a mandatory open given that the stacks are getting quite short. So we're facing an 8 big blind stack, a 13 and 13.5 big blind stack and a 20 big blind stack almost. So we wouldn't be that happy about getting, you know, 3-bet shoved on, but that's not enough reason to lay down a hand that we would normally be willing to steal from this position. So we're going to go ahead and make a small open. We do get called from the button by this player. At 30-11, his stats, he's not sort of super loose, so we'll have a look at what the flop brings. This is a flop where really we can't really continue against the lightly calling range. We expect him to call with lots of Broadway combinations of hands looking to hit something to get all his money in. So what we can actually do again here is just check and give up on the pot. So we do that, and he pushes all in for a little bit more than pot, and obviously we don't want to call with just our ace high here, so we just go for the check fold, and that's fine. So the next hand we're going to use that pattern of checking again to try and help us. So we raise again with aces. Obviously the raise is very clear. We keep our sizing the same so that we're consistent, so that no one can tell whether we have a strong or weak hand. And the same loose passive player calls us. So what we do here, we're much happier with this flop obviously because we have an overpair. We wouldn't plan on ever getting away from our overpair here, no matter what the action was. But again, what we want to do is to allow this player to remember and recall the previous hand where he shoved all in after we looked weak and checked. So we take the same line here, hoping that again he will bluff at us. Now it turns out that he checks back. Now that obviously means that he either has nothing, or that maybe he has some sort of weak showdown value that he just wants to get to showdown. But it's reasonable of us, once we've established a pattern of behavior, to use that pattern of behavior to sort of balance our hands. So we get the check here. Now that the turn pairs, there's really nothing to worry about. We're not going to let our opponent have another free card here. He didn't bluff on the flop, so there's no reason to expect he's going to start bluffing now. So we just bet for value now, enough so that should our opponent call here, we can shove the river for about a pot size bet and get our opponent all in if he does happen to have a queen or a jack here. But he just goes ahead and folds, and that's the end of that hand. Alright, on to the next one then. Okay, so we've lost a couple more players now. We're onto the bubble with a second stack, and I've just marked this hand because it's an interesting dynamic. This player here, El Campos, is a pretty good player at these stakes, knows what he's doing, and the one thing that he will understand here is how much pressure he can put on me as the middle stack when there's another shorter stack around who we're both, as it were, waiting to bust. And what that means is when I raise here with ace-3, I really leave myself open to getting abused, if you like, because he can just 3-bet against me with almost any two cards, and I can't really call this raise because that would be risking too many chips. Remember, I'm capable of busting here if I get all in and lose against the big stack, and therefore I need to be a little bit more selective about the hands that I open because I don't want him to 3-bet me. So I actually just let this hand go, even though normally if we have an ace in the button, it's going to be you know, a very standard raise. So I just let this one go and let these two play a pot, hoping to get into the money. Okay, so we move on to the next hand. Oops, we just missed one there. Let's go back. Okay, so we have Queen Jack suited, blind versus blind. It's a very easy defend. Again, we have to be a little bit careful though, because we are up against a big stack. So you could argue for a fold here, but I think that's maybe a little bit too cautious. Again, position's going to help us to manage the size of the pot and get our hand to showdown if we have some showdown value. So we make the call and we flop a flush draw. We get a check. And it's kind of interesting, this check, because we would assume that our opponent would just bet here, try and put a lot of pressure on us. He might assume that this board doesn't really hit our range, because he would probably, being a decent player, expect us to call with many of the kinds of hands that we've actually got here. Maybe some hands like ace-8, ace-9 and some Broadway hands. So it's unusual in a way that he doesn't bet here. So it does kind of make us feel like, you know, maybe he has a little something here. We certainly can bet with our draw, but we can also play a cautious approach, and definitely on the bubble, that's when a cautious approach is going to pay you more dividends. So although we can bet our draw here, we can also allow our opponent to give us a free card, try to hit either a pair or our flush on the turn, and make it more likely that we can realize the equity that we have with our hand on this board. So we elect to check back. Our opponent goes ahead and checks the turn. I think now it's reasonable to take a stab at the pot. He's shown us weakness on 2 streets, so it may well be that he's just giving up here. So we're going to take a stab at this pot. What we're trying to do when we bet here is really get him to fold a better hand. So for example, get him to try and fold king high or maybe ace high, where this board is, you know, one that he's maybe not very happy with. So we take a stab here. Again, nothing too big, trying to either take the pot down here or buy ourselves the free river card. Once he checks here and we bet, he's very unlikely to bet the river, you know, unless he has a value hand, and he calls. And then on this card here, we see that our opponent just shoves all in, exerting maximum pressure. It's possible that he's doing this as a bluff, but given his overall line, which is to check call on the turn and to check this flop, it really looks like he had something here. Of course, this hand does complete lots of straight draws that were present on the flop. Obviously, we're not going to call with queen high, so we just move on to the next hand. Alright, now we have king jack. Once again, getting a raise from this very loose player. And now that we're actually you can see in 3rd place here, because the stacks have been sort of switched around. We've obviously lost a pot to this Eat the Worm player. We're just using the fact that he steals with a very high percentage here. You can see cutoff steal is 40%, button steal 43%, small blind 63%. So we know that this player is going to be stealing with a great many hands. So we just use our Broadway blockers. That means we block some of the very strong hands that he might call a re-raise with, such as ace king, pocket kings, pocket jacks. Use those blockers to 3-bet shove all in and just take the pot down right here and now. Of course, we can get called there, but usually with this hand king jack, we're not going to be doing too badly. If we decide to just call there, we have all the disadvantages that one normally has of being out of position. So against someone raising many hands who generally have a weak range, 3-bet shove is a very legitimate option. Alright, so on to the next hand. Okay, and we've got Jack 9 suited, blind versus blind, and so this brings us to our first kind of shove fold spot in the game. So we're just going to pause it here and bring up some software. What we want to know is how many hands are we able to push from the small blind into the big blind, who has, as we can see up here, 7.2 big blinds. So we'll just pause and bring up some software to help us. Okay, so what I've done is to bring up some ICM software, that's independent chip model, and this is going to show us our proposed pushing range from the small blind in this spot. It's telling us that we should be pushing all hands here. if we press this little button here, it's going to send this hand to a Nash calculator, and that's going to show us the unexploitable ranges for both players. So this pushing range here of Jack 9 suited is going to be fine as long as our opponent is not calling us wider than this range here. And that's very likely in fact to be the case there. So you can see when we do make this push with Jack 9 suited, what it gains us is, if we just make this edge 0 here, it gains us 1.41% of the overall prize pool. You can see here it's a 6 max prize pool. A 6 max prize pool was 65.35. So if we just then go to the Nash range here, which we can get from hold'emresources.net, okay, by sending the hand there, you can see that from the small blind we should be pushing 68% of hands, and here's that breakdown of that range, and you can see that we can actually push any suited Jack here. So Jack deuce suited is a push, so we can be sure that Jack 9 suited is also a push. So we go ahead and make that unexploitable push, get a call from our opponent, which is certainly not what we want there. That means we're going to likely to be up against the stronger part of his range, and we're a little bit lucky there to make a straight against his ace high. His call is absolutely fine there. Again, if we look at the Nash range here, this is the range of hands that he can profitably call us. So he can call us with any ace, and the fact that he actually has an ace here and does call doesn't make our shove with Jack 9 suited bad. It's still profitable as long as he doesn't call us wider than this range here, which he didn't. So that's fine. Okay, so we get to the heads up portion of this match and on to the next hand. So we're in the big blind with 5-4 suited, and our opponent makes a minimum raise here. I would say that this is probably the ideal raise size on your heads up. We have a hand that's certainly not a great hand, but at least we have definitely some drawing potential with the suitedness and the connectedness. So I think a call here is not unreasonable. It's definitely towards the bottom of the range of hands that we can profitably call, especially against a good player, but I think it's not unreasonable. So we make the call. Not a great flop for us. We just see that with the 3 of diamonds we have a few backdoor draws, as we can call them. But so we're going to start with a check. We probably need to check fold against a bet here most of the time. Our opponent checks back, which is a little bit unusual, but we would normally expect him to bet here with the ace on board. When we turn here, this is really the sort of gin turn card for us with the 3, 4, 5, 6 and the diamonds, so we have an open and a straight flush draw. Definitely want to be betting now. The reason for the bet here is obviously we would like to make our draw, but if we don't make our draw it would be great to win the pot with just 5 high. If we check here, we don't put any pressure on our opponent. That means he can just check back. So for example, if he's trying to check down here with a hand like king high or queen high, we're not going to be able to win the pot without building up some bluffing pressure, if you like. So for example, if it goes check check here and then on the river we try to bluff, it's going to be very cheap for our opponent to make a call against us. So we bet here, hoping to take the pot down right now, and our opponent calls us. So on the river we don't make our draw and we don't improve our hand to a pair, and so the question now becomes, well, can we represent anything here by a bluff? And what we see actually is this is a very bad card to bet on, because our opponent told us that he was happy with his hand, he believed he had a good hand or the best hand, enough that he was willing to call our turn bet. So unless we have exactly a 6 here, he's going to still be happy with his hand. So when the board pairs, it's often time to give up. There's nothing really that we can represent here except something like an ace, and there wouldn't necessarily be that many ace X hands in our flat calling range pre-flop. So it's fine to just give up sometimes if the board doesn't run out in a way that's favorable to you. If this card here was a spade, then we would be able to represent some flushes which we'd led on the turn, and that would be a better bluffing card. But we're just going to give up here and we see that our opponent had Jack 3 suited and was checking back on the flop with a pair. I don't know whether he's going to fold his hand on the river, but I think it's reasonable to expect that he might just look us up here, because when we get called on the turn, we might be concerned that he has a 6, and therefore we might not bet with a 9 or an ace here. We might be feeling, cautious or nervous with that hand. So I think it's reasonable that he might look us up there. Alright, and on to the next hand. Okay, and we get a raise again. Similar sort of situation to the last one, a little bit more of an easier call with a slightly higher suited connector. We can 3-bet this hand from time to time, but in general with the suited connectors, you want to keep the pot as small as possible, because that's going to allow you to see more turns than rivers. So here we go, we flop a pair here. So we start with a check, hoping again for our opponent to bet. And once again he checks back. So what we might assume by that is that he has some kind of showdown value here. The turn pairs. So the least likely hand in his range is actually a 9, both because there are now 2 9s on board, and also because he didn't value bet the flop. So we would expect that any 9 would value bet, make a continuation bet for value. So that means we probably have the best hand here most of the time. But certainly there are some cards that we don't want to see on the river, such as an 8, which might make a straight. Also a heart's going to make a possible flush. We don't really want to see any cards higher than a 9 either, because they may hit his overcards. So definitely reasonable to make a bet for value. And at this point our opponent makes a very small raise here. So it definitely seems that he's trying to represent a 9 here. So the question is, do we think it's likely that he would check back a 9 on the flop? It's certainly possible, but I think it's less likely that he would check it back than that he would bet it. So we make the call, and then on the river all of the draws missed except for 5-3, which again I think I would expect him to continuation bet here. So we check, and at this point our opponent makes a pot size bet here. So it's really a case of him saying that he's either got trips here, 3 9s, or really nothing, because there's nothing else that makes sense for him to have here. We don't think he'd bet this much with a 6. He should be a little bit concerned that we have some 9x hands in our range, and therefore it's really sort of an all or nothing bet here. The only hand that really beats us here that he'd play like this is a 9, and again it's not that likely he'd play 9, so we just look him up here, and he does show a flush draw that he turned and bluff raised us, which the raise is not unreasonable, but I think on the river it's a little bit ambitious, this bluff. He doesn't tell a very convincing story, so maybe it's a bit optimistic to expect that we'd fold a 6, but the main thing I'd say is he doesn't really need to make this river bet so big. If he puts us on a hand like he has, for example a flush draw, he's actually going to get us to fold that misdraw with a much smaller bet here. So fairly heavy handed. We're going to jump to this next hand of the sit and go, and we make a very standard raise with ace queen. We actually get 3-bet shoved on here. We're not really ever going to plan to raise fold this hand heads up, so we're just going to click on the call. We see that our opponent has a7 offsuit. I think it's not the worst 3-bet shove heads up, but it's for 28 big blinds. It's probably not going to be that profitable. Part of the reason is that my small blind raise, or my button raise, is actually only 39%, which isn't that high here. So I think against that range he's really not going to ever get called by worse hands for this kind of blind level. So I'd prefer to see either a 3-bet and then a fold if I 4-bet on him, or maybe even just a call at this stack depth. So move on to the next hand. We have queen deuce, and our opponent shoves on us. He's only now got 2.5 big blinds, so we pretty much, you can see here, we're getting 31%, 2.25 to 1 odds on a call. So really with anything other than the very worst hands, we need to just make a call here. So click on call, and our opponent has a slightly better hand and gets there, and then on to the last hand. Very easy. He has 5.5 big blinds. Have a very easy call here with ace 10, and we're lucky enough to hold this hand. And not an unreasonable shove from him. He's very short. Any blinds that he can pick up without seeing showdown are really going to help his stack. So it's reasonable for him to shove quite wide on us here. So that's how that sit and go ended up. So hopefully the hands that we've looked at in this session have shown you some of the key themes for being profitable at these sit and goes. Definitely want to keep it simple as far as possible. Look for opportunities to exploit the looser players who are likely to make big mistakes post flop, and just try to think through each hand logically about what is your best line, the best way of accumulating chips. Try and keep it simple. Running huge bluffs with no chance of winning the hand other than by bluffing is generally not the best way to do well in these low stakes sit and goes. And as I say, just keeping it simple and thinking logically through each hand. Thank you very much indeed for watching. As I say, my name's Tim64, aka Onthestoop, and hopefully see you at the tables in the future.